Verdun Flankway Wave, the most brutal, costly, and bloodiest battle of World War One, and maybe even the world after Stalingrad, of course. A mill on the Meuse, a wholesale slaughter, a battle of attrition, and the longest battle of World War One, and had an entire city on the siege, like Stalingrad, after it. It was also a turning point in World War One, just like Stalingrad. And in 1916, this was France's Stalingrad. And it also triggered two other colossal offensives. Two that would go down in both Russian and British military history as the bloodiest days for those armies as well. But this is the German side of the Battle of Verdun. So von Falkenhayn, he unleashed this battle on the 21st of February 1916. He had no clear-cut goals. His only goal was to bluten Frankreich wide, which is to bleed France white. A battle of attrition. One death every second for almost the whole year, night and day, inside and outside of the forts. It was also a sign of French resistance as well. And what happened here would decide the winners and losers. And in just 4 months, 24 million shells from both German and French artillery were fired. More than 2 shells, that was more than 2 shells every second, day and night, in contrast. But why Verdun? Why Verdun though? Both Entente and Central Powers quickly saw a quick victory scenario dashed by 1916. The German army had marched through Belgium and France. He said there was a deadlock stalemate, trench warfare. The Kaiser was to be in Paris by this time, by Christmas. He told his commanders, especially von Falkenhayn, he needed to renew pressure on the French. But where and how they were going to do this? Von Falkenhayn wanted a battle of attrition, slaughter on a massive scale. But now, why Verdun the city? It was located in northeastern France, near the German border. Let's take a bit of a step back in history. But recently it was the siege of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and only after Paris had capitulated did Verdun surrender as well. So Verdun was basically the bait in a giant trap to have a massive breakthrough in the French lines. He used artillery to destroy the newly made defences, and his calculations were 5 dead Frenchmen for every 1 or 2 German soldiers. The French thought Verdun was to be impenetrable. They had made a ring of forts from 5 to 13 miles around the city, most impressive being Fort Douaumont, the most damaged fort of the whole battle, and the most strategic one as well. Being 100 feet above sea level, you could look out through the entire valley and maybe even see Paris from on top of the hill. That's why soldiers call it the strategic grounds. I mean, that was some pretty good naming convention as well. It may look small if you actually go and visit it, like a hobbit's house inside the hill, but when you go inside Fort Douaumont, it's miles and miles of quarters, bunkers, kitchens, everything. Had fortress guns, artillery, barracks, mess halls, electricity, rooms, everything needed. But despite the close proximity to Germany and its strategic grounds, it was a rather quiet sector, maybe the most peaceful sector until 1916, of course. It was better than being in the trenches, of course, mud, dust, trench foot. But honestly, it was for second-rate troops like older men, recently injured, but not enough to be taken off in battle, some colonial troops as well. So it was really the underbelly, the soft spot, and von Falkenhayn was ready to test this. It was called Operation Gericht. It was Operation Judgment, a trial of strength. The first targets the men had were the Meuse, the Verdun forest area. They brought over 850 artillery pieces, including railway guns. Also, factory had to make at least 1 million shells for just the first phase alone. And to carry the shells to the front, it also needed 1,300 track cars to transport it all, of course. All scout planes were in the air by this time. The Fokker D1 ruled the skies. taking down French recon planes, and they were careful not to let intelligence leave the lines. But Verdun had no idea what it was in for. It was a complete tactical surprise. Everything was planned. Most of the men were housed in on-the-ground bunkers near the forest area at Verdun, and it housed more than 72 battalions, which is about 172,000 men, 7,200,000 men, maybe. The artillery needed to see in order to support the assault and kill as many Frenchmen as possible, especially the artillery gunners on the French side. And the balloons were, well, balloons, so gusts of wind, fog, even snow could drag the artillery balloon down, so they had to wait on February the 21st, the infamous February the 21st, because the winter months were still in effect, so they had to wait till everything was clear. Everything had to be perfect. So the bombardment began at 7:12 a.m. in the morning. Naval cannons fired, hitting the cathedral, but they reworked their artillery to hit the intended target, which was the railway station. They fired in a formation called demi-fleur. Artillery hitting the ground created a sound of drumming as artillery hit the ground and exploded in the air, turning trees into little more than matchwood. But the terror wasn't over yet. Once the artillery had stopped, the German pre-stormtrooper assault troops rushed forward with flamethrowers, grenades, and assaulted the French garrisons. Could anyone stop the Germans' advance? Part of von Falkenhayn's plans for capturing Fort Douaumont was to capture the high ground and threaten the town and the French soldiers as well. By the time, though, the French had moved most of their big guns out and back into Verdun, and 58 soldiers were in the fort to defend it against 750 men. Captain Han Jimps-Hump told his men to make a human triangle, and he climbed up into a small gun hole, then followed by another, and 90 men were in the fort of Fort Douaumont. And the men had no choice inside to surrender, and the mightiest fort in France had actually fired without a shot. Germany was winning, not just this battle, but they could be winning the whole war. But like all steamrolls, things were starting to fall short. First of all, they had outdated uniforms. They had the steel helm, but that was issued to pioneers and pre-stormtroopers. And they had the Gewehr 98, which is a great rifle. Many rifles were called New Mauser, Cyan, Mauser this, Mauser that, the greatest bolt action ever made. But it only had 5 rounds against even a Lebel, which had 8 rounds, and there were some British at Verdun, not a lot. So the SMLE had 10 rounds. Imagine carrying about 8 banana magazine rounds to 2 big MG boxes rounds. So the Germans were outdone. The uniforms were kind of outdated. They still had the pickle helm. They did have some stout helms, but only for the pioneers and the pre-stormtroopers. And also the whole logistic and the whole battle of attrition kind of got to the men. Even though Crown Prince Wilhelm said that we were going to take Verdun, we're going to take these forts, we're going to be marching in Verdun by the end of the month, the soldiers could have kind of see past that. Even though Crown Prince Wilhelm was more a very competent leader, very competent general, even though he was the Kaiser's son, so he had to be brought up for the people to love him. But he was very confident. He knew when to stop. So they had poor leadership, well, not really guns, but kind of outproduced in guns, and they had outdated uniforms. The steamroll was starting to fall short, and the battle of attrition was not working as well as von Falkenhayn planned. And one more trick up the French sleeve was their main ally, Britain. You see, Britain was actually supplying France with all the money, all the machine guns. Well, not Britain was supplying them with all the money needed to make weapons, to buy food stuff, to pay more troops. Well, not really pay, because most of the troops were patriotic in that kind of sense. But they were paid more, and also Germany got less. So France was getting more stuff than Germany, because Germany was cut off by the naval blockade that Britain had imposed on them. And Britain was borrowing money from Wall Street and then in turn giving it to the French, and the British Empire brought in a lot of money and manpower as well. So it was the richest country. So von Falkenhayn's real initiative was to bleed France white, get France out of the war, and turn Europe into 1916-1917 Fortress Europe, which was to make Britain unable to get a foothold on the continent, because Russia gave up in 1917. They could not foresee this. It's 1916. They could not foresee this. But von Falkenhayn think that the Russians were pretty easy. They got beaten in Tannenberg, outnumbered 10-1, and they were being rolled back all the way to the Masurian Lakes in Galicia. And the biggest threat to Germany was basically Britain, because Britain was blocking the whole trade. They were blocking machines and ammunition and food from getting to the German people and the German army itself. So, and also, one more thing before we wrap up. The Brusilov offensive and the Somme offensive happened because of Verdun, to relieve pressure off of Verdun and to get Germans from taking more and more out of Verdun, because Hindenburg and Ludendorff were seeing that Verdun was pretty much a lost cause at this point, especially since they were losing and had to put men on the Eastern Front and put men on the Somme. The German offensive at Verdun slowly halted by October, and by December France had caught back Verdun from German hands. And Verdun was to be proven untakeable, and the motto "Les passons en passe" was to be triumph for the French.